Well, thank you, Dustin, and welcome everyone to Transforming Old Norse-Icelandic Literature, the Symposium. It's incredible to see everybody, everybody's faces and names together this morning. When communicating with Dustin, Dustin Gerard, today's conference organizer, he asked me if I would be willing to speak for a very few minutes about an aspect of my own work. After some contemplation, I've decided to speak briefly about how some of my work has developed in connection with the series of conferences Dustin and his co-organizers have held over the years on medievalism, specifically Medieval Modern 1, Medieval Modern 2, Medieval Modern and Medieval Modern 3 that took place in 2015, 2016, and 2017, which in a way culminate in today's symposium. This is the fourth medievalism symposium I have participated in, which Dustin Gerard has been the principal organizer or co-organizer. In the first symposium, Medieval Modern 1 in 2015, I presented a paper on the transmission of the classic Icelandic text, the Lay of Vafthrûdnir. This paper has now been turned into an article and is a chapter in the forthcoming book edited by Dustin Gerard and Christopher Crocker, the book which brings many of us together today. In the second symposium, Medieval Modern 2, I presented a paper on the role of myth in the modern age, first focusing on two aspects of Old Norse mythology as found in the surviving texts: Odin's hanging from Yggdrasil and Bergelmir's possible birth scene in Vafthrûdnismal, and how these scenes might have antecedents in even more ancient texts and now have descendants in fiction and film. I haven't yet done anything with this paper, but my limited participation today inspires me to dig it up, and hopefully at the next symposium, I will have more to say on the flickering flames of myth in the modern age. The 2016 symposium was particularly memorable, as we welcomed today's first speaker, Arman Jakobson, to Winnipeg in person for that event, for which he delivered the keynote address. It is out of Medieval Modern 2, which was co-organized by Dustin Gerard, Christopher Crocker, and Elizabeth Ann Johnson, that the forthcoming book really sprung into shape. In 2017, it was time for Medieval Modern 3, and I remember meeting Jane Toswell at that event, who was brought to Winnipeg as that year's keynote speaker. I was able to attend a workshop led by Jane Toswell the day before the symposium, where we had a memorable roundtable discussion and commented on each other's articles that now form the chapters for the above mentioned and forthcoming book. And now we are here in 2021, and the series of medievalism conferences have gone through their own transformation into the present event, transforming Old Norse Icelandic literature. It is a great honor to introduce our first two panelists of today's event, who will present on the panel titled Old Norse Literature and Realism. The first speaker, Dr. Arman Jakobson, is professor of early Icelandic literature at the University of Iceland. Arman is currently editing a new history of Icelandic literature along with 5 other scholars, and he has just begun writing a new book called Gudrun and the Ghost that is meant to explore the turn to using sagas as sources for mentalities. His paper is titled Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Medieval Iceland, Saga Realism and the Sworn Brothers. The second speaker is Dr. Heather O'Donoghue, professor of Old Norse at Linacre College, University of Oxford. Heather's book, Narrative in the Icelandic Family Saga, Meanings of Time in Old Norse Literature, was published by Bloomsbury last month. She is currently co-editing the Cambridge History of Old Norse Icelandic History, and her next project is a book about Beowulf. Her paper is titled Madness, Mythology, and Mitteleuropa, Günter Grass's Transformation of Old Norse Myth in the Tin Drum. Ármann will speak first for about 20 minutes, and then Heather will speak for about the next 20 minutes. After the 40 minutes or so have passed, there will be a shared question period. I encourage everyone to think of questions for the two speakers. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Ármann.
Yeah, thank you. It seems only a short while ago I was with you in Winnipeg for the second conference, and you may note my Zoom background, which is extremely patriotic, but this is turned on because I'm sitting at home in front of my DVD collection, Canadian classics that you would all recognize, and I don't want to distract you too much with it. So this is, in a way, the same paper I gave 5 years ago, but fortunately, and then I had 40 minutes, but fortunately I've been working on it for 5 years, and thus I can now deliver it in 20 minutes. This is what 5 years can do to a study. And the study concerns the transformative power of the realistic versus the fantastical reception of the medieval Icelandic sagas, and mainly Fólkaflóða Saga, the topic of this talk. And it is no secret that the study of the sagas evolved in the period where realism was you can say, the new direction of literature, and many important studies were published in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when realism was king in Scandinavia. And thus it was high praise indeed to refer to the sagas as realistic literature. Einar Ólafur Sveinsson coined the term heroic realism to describe the sagas. And the heroic part of this was questioned long ago by Theodor Andersen in his very important study of Gísla Saga. But it is still very much a scholarly myth that the sagas are realistic literature. And this could only happen by simply ignoring all fantastical elements in the sagas, such as the supernatural or the paranormal. And one of the best examples of how that was done was the introduction of Björn Sigfússon of Ljósvetninga Saga in the Íslensk Fornleif series, where he simply divides everything in the sagas into fiction and fact. And the definition of fiction is what Björn Sigfússon cannot bring himself to believe. That is simple, and the rest is fact. Jón Helgason criticized this very bravely in Einar Ólafur Sveinsson's Fashrift from 1969, and said something like, it is dubious to believe that if you take magic out of a story about magic, what remains is a true story. So this is I feel Jón hits the nail on the head, in that for his contemporary scholars, it was the realism that made the sagas great, but not the prophecies or conjurations or any fantastic elements. Writing in 1993, Preben Moilengracht Sørensen said that the sagas demand to be taken seriously as accurate accounts of the past. But he also said that this is an artistic illusion. And you could add to this that history as a narrative form in the Middle Ages does not necessarily demarcate clearly between a legendary and a well-documented past, and that omens, portents, and paranormal figures have their place in a work of medieval history. So what, of course, is always an impediment in determining whether the sagas are realistic or not is that we do not have much audience reaction to these narratives. When we speak of the reception of the sagas, it's usually the modern reception because we know so little of the medieval reception. There was a belief among scholars in the 20th century that the medieval audience would have been partly skeptical, and of course we do have statements from some of the sagas about how believable they are, not so much in the sagas of Icelanders, but more in the Fornaldarsögur. So the legend and the fact are in a way intertwined in this period. It is also important to remember that in all fiction, a certain degree of plausibility is required. Even what we now call fantasy is, even if you're in a possession of a magic ring, for example, you still have to cross a march or climb a slope, and it's difficult. So even in modern fantastic fiction, there is always a realistic, plausible element, be it only in the characters themselves who act like normal people, people that we could identify with or feel that we could know. So one of the issues when determining whether a saga is realistic or fantastic is that in this debate, people tend to use our modern scientific understanding of the world as the yardstick of what's realistic and the fantastic. But this scientific understanding is not the medieval understanding. And of course, when you look at it, Einar Ólafur Sveinsson and his generation believed that the sagas had evolved from realistic to fantastic, but when you look at the categories of old and young sagas, you can see that all of them have supernatural elements, and this is not really any yardstick. I have chosen Fóstbræðra Saga as an example in this talk because it is weird, and it is a good example of what happens when you try to interpret the sagas in a realistic vein. And this may be one of the reasons, as this saga proved to be excellent fodder for Helga Kress when she then was trying to use the Bakhtinian approach to the sagas, and she determined that Fóstbræðra Saga was a satire or parody, and which of course was heavily criticized, but it was a convincing article because Fóstbræðra Saga is definitely queer in some way. So Preben Møllingard Sørensen was one of the people who criticized her, saw the saga as a Christian and learned text, and had reservations about the Bakhtinian approach. Helga Kress's article has been well received. It's more, the criticism of it has mostly been whether the Bakhtinian approach can be used at all. So if we look at Fóstbræðra Saga, it is a story of two blood brothers, Þorgeir Halvarsson and Þormóður Kolbrúnarskald, who served Saint Olafur of Norway, who died in 1030, and according to 13th century Icelandic sagas, Þormóður died with him on Stiklastaðir, and the narrative even begins with the king, and then frames the protagonists as his retainers, even in theological terms. They were all best estimated by God, who were in favor of with the king, it says. The close friendship of Þormóður and Þorgeir is perceived by many modern readers as distinctly odd, and this is something I have seen myself when teaching the saga, because they come across as very clear opposites. But this is not necessarily what the saga says. It introduces them as like minds, and what they have in common is being pugnacious and later unpopular, or even bullies. They are men who never back off from any brawl and are unpopular in the region. And in the narrative, their hubris is emphasized, although Þorgeir himself says that they excel in boldness and manliness. Of the two, Þorgeir Hávarsson is the stronger. He is ambitious and an accomplished warrior from a young age. Þormóður, in turn, becomes an ardent womanizer, whereas Þorgeir is said to be not a ladies' man, since he felt he abused his manliness by stooping towards women. And in aggressive demeanor, he is clearly the most exaggerated of the two. When he hears of his father's death, he does not show any reaction. He is said to rarely laugh and is usually unfriendly to everybody. But the saga also depicts him as soldierly, and any criticism of Þorgeir is far from overt in the saga. The narrator keeps praising him and says that his heart was so secure and hard that he knew no fear, and this was due to the fact that the greatest smith of all had made Þorgeir's battle prowess as great as a lion. But it's still repeated in the saga how terrifying and unpopular the two men, and the audience is thus alerted to the possibility that the heroes of the narrative could be interpreted as villainous by others. In one of the versions of the saga, there is an anecdote where Þorgeir Hávarsson decapitates a man who stoops for no better reason than that his stance offered too good a chance for such a blow to let it pass. This is taking bullying to a new level and very likely to shock even those who would normally accept warlike behavior. The anecdote may be regarded as humorous, but it would hardly have made Þorgeir more likable to a medieval audience, and it is indeed off-putting to modern readers as well. So we have in Þorgeir an unfriendly, harsh, and pugnacious character who is repelled by women, is unable to smile and laugh, more or less hostile and unfriendly to everyone, and whose way of life entails attacking the guilty and innocent alike. So he kills innocent bystanders, and he does not temper his aggression with any characteristics such as mercy, clemency, generosity, very often seen in the sagas. So Þorgeir is not like the intelligent and sensitive Egill of Egil saga, or the ironic and witty Skarphéðinn, Njáls saga, or the helpful Grettir of Grettir saga, and other troublesome heroes of medieval Iceland. And yet Þorgeir is vigorously defended by the saga narrator. After his death, revenge becomes the main reason for Þormóður's whole existence. After he has proven his allegiance to Þorgeir, he comes to the court of St. Oliver to die in the king's service. And clearly the audience is expected to accept this in spite of Þorgeir's flawed character, because if they don't, the plot will fall apart. There is clearly something in Þorgeir that makes him worthy of such devotion, and the devotion itself is remarkable enough to appeal to the saga's implied audience. So the unity of Fossbladder Saga would seem to demand treating it as a revenge narrative, but also a kind of a love story of the two misfits, one of whom makes it his purpose in life to avenge the others. But to the modern reader, their bond seems fairly incomprehensible. And it's very hard to wonder what they see in each other, what loyalty Þormóður owes to Þorgeir, and how such an unlovable character could earn himself such devotion. So this is one of the reasons Fossbladder Saga is a tough sell to most modern readers and easy to interpret as satire or irony or parody. The audience has to accept the great love and loyalty between the two protagonists, and to do that, they not only have to accept Þorgeir as a figure worthy of devotion, but also to accept that these two men who seem so unlike are, in spite of that, like minds. I'm arguing in this study that this dilemma is only present when the saga is read as a realistic narrative. And this is a natural impulse for the modern reader reading a saga. But all realistic approaches to this particular story, the instinct of the modern reader to treat these figures as actual flesh and blood humans from the distant past, to leave an understanding of the two men and the relationship strangely elusive. It is, however, possible to decide that Þorgeir and Þormóður are not realistic characters, and the fact that these two cardboard heroes are so entwined that when one of them that they have symbolic value, that they're spiritual doubles, and in fact, as I say in my title, a medieval Icelandic Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, whose contrasting characters make sense only if the audience begins to think of them as one composite personality, the extremes of which are externalized into distinct characters. Such externalization is commonplace in fairy tales and other symbolic narratives, and there are countless studies of fairy tales about their symbolism, and also of fornaldarsögur. David Erlingsson, for example, has interpreted Günter Saga in this way, but very few studies of the sagas of Icelanders. But if we see Fossbladder Saga as a symbolic story, the unity of the blood brothers is more understandable. They make more sense as one man, part of whom is rough and unsociable, never laughs, disdains women, the more introvert part of the composite man. The other half, more social, enjoys being a womanizer and a hedonist. And indeed, the story ends with Þormóður watching bits of his own heart come out at Stiklasdalur, along with an arrow that has pierced it. And his heart turns out to be big and soft, whereas before it had been stressed in one of the learned clauses of the narrative that Þorgeir's heart, by contrast, was tiny and hard. And this interpretation could also shed some light on the significance of the revenge motive. After Þorgeir has been killed, Þormóður internalizes his dead companion and spends the rest of his life attempting to avenge him. And then he immortalizes his friend in a poem and enters the service of the king in order to die for him. So choosing life never seems to have been an option for the remaining half of the blood brothers. So if we see the story as taking place within Þormóður's psyche, as a story of personal growth, of the path taken by the juvenile delinquent towards heroic death in service of the king, the story seems to make more sense. In the beginning, the Þorgeir personality is dominant, with all its dislike of the feminine, its social roughness, its egoistic disregard for human society, and the lives of the two blood brothers seems dominated by a juvenile misinterpretation of heroism, manliness, and bravery. After Thorgeir is killed, Þormóður cannot take leave of him, only cleanse his dead foster brother through the quest for satisfaction and bloody revenge. But after he has commemorated Thorgeir properly and brought him the honor he deserves, he can go on to serve the king as his own new self, a brave but selfless man who dies for a good cause in good spirit, with Thorgeir-esque bravery tempered by good cheer and wit. The message, like in fairy tales, is essentially unspoken, but still simple, and thus easily internalized by the audience, perhaps emotionally rather than intellectually, but no less accessible to a medieval audience than a modern one. This is a common reaction to all stories, but when they are presented as history, it sometimes seems less urgent to seek their symbolic or emotional truth than when the audience is knowingly digesting fantasy or fairy tale. So this, in conclusion, I think I have spoken for 20 minutes now. With this interpretation, the story of Thorgeir and Þormóður ends up being more uplifting than the tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The foster brothers were inseparable, but did not need to perish together. The latter half of the saga concerns Þormóður's survival and eventual separation from Thorgeir as he enters the service of the king and shares his new master's heroic martyrdom. Thorgeir, having been incorporated by his blood brother, shared in this glory, although he is never mentioned again until Þormóður has reached the king and told him of Thorgeir's exploits. So in this interpretation, the audience is essential. It is, in fact, fueled by a need for the story to make sense to the audience, and thus may serve as a tiny demonstration how a medieval narrative can make sense to a modern, and possibly also to a medieval audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ármann. I'm sure there's many virtual applause. We'll hold questions back for Ármann until after our next speaker, Heather O'Donoghue, and I'll pass it over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everybody. So in this talk, I want to show how the German novelist, Günter, repeatedly used elements of Old Norse myth in his novel, Die Blechtrommel, the Tin Drum, which was published in 1959 and which many regard as one of the great European historical novels of the 20th century. Oscar Matzerath, the protagonist of the Tin Drum, announces in the very first sentence of the novel that he's in a mental hospital. So we're primed to engage with an unreliable narrator, as indeed Oscar proves to be. He recounts the circumstances of his own conception and birth. His alleged neonatal impressions are hearing his mother's promise that he'll be given a toy drum on his 3rd birthday, and the drumming noise that a moth makes as it flutters against a light bulb. And he is indeed given a drum for his 3rd birthday, but on that very same day, he tells us, he flung himself through an open trapdoor, a horrific childhood accident which Oscar represents as a deliberate and carefully considered act. And he ascribes his subsequent failure to grow as a conscious exercise of his own will. So he ends his growth exactly as he begins his career as a drummer. The disturbing dislocation between Oscar's physical appearance and his malevolent and fantastically precocious intelligence fundamentally undermines our negotiation of actuality and absurdity. The setting of the novel, the city of Gdansk, in roughly the first half of the 20th century, is a real historical chronicle. The region was disputed between Poland and what was to become Nazi Germany. Grass is specific about historical event and topographical and geographical detail, and his characters are naturalistic, if sometimes grotesque, portraits. But History is presented in Grass's fiction as an almost incidental backdrop to Oscar's solipsistic world. For example, the difficulty and obsessive necessity of replacing his worn-out drums looms larger in his narrative than the invasion of France, or Nazi rallies, or the storming of the Polish post office. And sometimes Oscar explicitly downgrades historical events as just minor and tiresome annoyances. We see only a reflection of the real world, refracted through Oscar's warped, limited, and often impossible point of view. So the novel has been recognized as a work in the so-called magic realist genre, in which typically a realistic setting is combined with openly fantastical elements, often drawing on mythic materials. And that brings me to my subject. Dwarfs and drums are key features of Old Norse myth, although, interestingly enough, not in conjunction with one another. Dwarfs are clever, malevolent, and sexually threatening creatures, and their most prominent role in Old Norse myth is as creators of the Mead of poetry, as curators, of the Mead of poetry. We can compare Oscar's active and sometimes predatory sexual history in the Tin Drum. Also, Old Norse dwarfs lurk underground, and they share this with Oscar too, with his persistent recourse to small, dark, and quasi or actually underground spaces. For example, his grandmother's skirts, uncomfortably reinforcing his voyeuristic sexuality, being under the rostrum at Nazi rallies, cellars, wardrobes, and under beds. Oscar's drum also has an Old Norse counterpart. The most prominent of the Norse gods, Odin, has often been identified as a shamanistic figure, as a sorcerer, a shapeshifter, a god in touch with other and underworlds. Further, as Neil Price puts it, one of the primary attributes of shamans across the circumpolar region is the drum. In Lokasenna, in which the malevolent demigod Loki gate-crashes a feast and charges all the Norse gods with terrible kinds of wickedness and perversion, Loki accuses Odin of tapping on a drum like a witch. Of course, there's also a realistic dimension to Oscar's drumming, the annoying action of a small child, or even the obsessive head-banging of a disturbed child, or the repetitive movement of a child on the autistic spectrum. But Oscar's drum is not a child's toy. As well as magically affecting external events, his drumming conjures up memories, inducing trance-like states in which Oscar is transported to other places and other times. This is distinctly shamanic. Incidentally, one of Odin's many pseudonyms is Oski, fulfiller of desire or wisher. So these are loose but suggestive enough parallels. What I want to turn to now are some Old Norse episodes which have very distinct echoes in Grass's narrative. Intriguingly, they're surprisingly evenly distributed in this novel, 2 in each of the 3 books of the novel. Further, it's apparent that on close reading of the episodes, Grass sets up a considerable degree of intratextuality. That is, allusions to one episode are made in another, and sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly. So, number 1, spit soup and the Mead of poetry. In the Old Norse myth of how poetry originated, 2 tribes of Norse gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, make the truce, which involves both sides spitting into a vat. And we then see the successive transformation of this liquid into almost every abjected human fluid: spit, blood, vomit, and liquid feces. Compare this, then, with a scene from early on in the Tin Drum, when Oscar's neighbours' children are concocting a nauseating soup mix. The first ingredient is the disgusting spit of an old man who is repulsively described as coughing up 3 gobs of it into the children's cauldron. 2 of the children, including the only girl there, Susie, urinate in the mixture. Ironically, this makes another of the children sick and he vomits into the soup, and the children force Oscar to drink it. Now, on one level, this is a particularly stomach-churning, I'm sorry for those of you who are coming up to lunchtime, a particularly stomach-churning description of the actions of hateful child bullies. But this mixture of bodily fluids in their pot is, of course, reminiscent of the successive transformations of Snorri's Mead of poetry, And if we see Oscar with his drum as the producer of the narrative, we could interpret his spoonful of the spit soup as a gross parody of Odin's ingestion of poetic inspiration. But in this episode, there are allusions to all the other myth-derived episodes in the novel. For instance, as the children stare into their horrible brew, Grass describes them as fishing into the cooking pot with their eyes, obviously reflecting the very next episode in the novel, which is based on the story of Thor and the fishing trip to cook the world serpent. Further, the little girl, Susie, who cannot urinate directly into the cauldron, instead pisses into another little pot, making a tinny, tinkling sort of sound. And this prefigures the appearance, a little bit later in the novel, the very peculiar weighing scale in a local shop, which plays a tinkling tune when produce is weighed. And this is derived from the Norse model too, as we shall see. So 2, fishing for the world serpent. Grass sets his version of Thor's expedition to fish for the world serpent in the domestic world of Oscar's childhood in Kashubia. Oscar is at the seaside, and he and his mother come across an old fisherman with a clothesline for a fishing line, the end of which has no float, but simply disappears down into the depths. In an allusion to the spit soup scene, Grass describes in some detail how the fisherman spits into the sea, and I'm sorry again, and how the seagulls swoop down to feed on this disgusting liquid. Grass tells us that it's cold for mother and son out there, as in the Old Norse, Hymir feared it would be for his companion Thor, and Oscar's mother becomes anxious to go, as Hymir was. And when the fisherman begins to haul in the line, he struggles to haul in the catch, recalling Thor's braced legs and white knuckles as he tries to haul up the world serpent. On the end of his line is a horse's head, which the fishermen have been using as bait for catching not sea monsters, but little serpents, eels. Now, anyone might well be sick at this moment, but Oscar's mother's vomiting recalls again the preparation of the spit soup, and Odin, indeed, heaving up the mead of poetry into a container in Ausgarden. And Oscar's mother even changes colour, like Hymir did. She's also described as having cow's eyes. And our final Norse-derived episode in the Tin Drum reprises the myth of the primordial matriarchal cow, Auðumla, who licks the very first human into being. 3, Freya's necklace. I turn now in Book 2 to Grass's account of Oscar's first proper sexual awakening. Although he's 16, he's still the size of a 3-year-old child, and the contrast between his childlike appearance and his frankly expressed sexual feelings makes for quite disturbing reading. His first love, we are told, is Maria Trujinski, who is called upon to look after what she thinks is an innocent little 3-year-old, recalling incidentally, of course, the Old Norse Övar Odd Saga. Maria cares for him as a nurse would care for a child, washing him and dressing him. One day, Maria takes him to the seaside, in fact, the very place where the old fisherman sickened Oscar's mother with a horse's head. Naturally, they've taken the same streetcar, and its bell makes the same tinkling sound as Susie's urine in the little pot, and indeed the strange weighing scales. Now, Maria is wearing a necklace of red wooden cherries. In Old Norse, Freya's most distinctive attribute is a necklace, the Brísingamen. And Maria's necklace, as well as being pretty striking, seems to be infused with distinctly sexual promise. The wooden cherries are described as looking as if they're about to burst with ripeness. When Maria undresses in front of Oscar, her nakedness gives him an erection, and unable to control himself, he flings himself at her and buries his face in her pubic hair. She laughs at him, but presses him to herself, apparently to comfort him, but in a shadowy intimation of a sexual act. The only thing she's wearing is the necklace. 4, the musical weighing scales. Now, we're told that a shopkeeper called Gref was something of an amateur inventor, And one of his inventions is a weighing scale which plays a tune whenever he weighs out goods for his customers. Well, it's not clear how he constructed this contrivance or indeed how it operated. Oscar simply relates that Gref installed a sort of glockenspiel in the weighing scale. Now, a glockenspiel traditionally has metal plates so that it makes tinny music, like Susie's urine in the little pot, like the tramcar's bell, and of course, like Oscar's tin drum. And a strange musical weighing scale features in Old Norse literature too. The 10th century Icelandic poet Einar Helgason had the nickname Skálaglam, which is usually translated in English as scale tinkle. German scholarship sometimes renders this nickname as Waagschalen-klingler, echoing the very words that Kras uses for the sound of the metal music elsewhere. In Jomsvikinga Saga, Einar Helgason is rewarded for his poetry with, and I quote, "a fine pair of scales made of burnished silver and gilt all over. With it there were two weights, one was gold, the other silver. The peculiarity of the weights was this, that when the earl put them on the scales and said what they were to signify, if that one came up which he wanted, then it trembled in the bowl, so that there was given off a tinkling sound. The earl gave the scales to Einar, and he was delighted with the gift." Now, how these scales played their tune isn't very clear either, and it seems likely that the saga author himself wasn't all that sure. Now, I realise that this parallel, whilst it's pretty mysterious, isn't exactly mythic, but there's just a striking point I wanted to make. How would Grass have come across Jomsviking saga? Well, according to the saga, the Jomsvikings occupied a stronghold on the Baltic coast, a place now identified as Volyn, right next to Gdansk. So maybe the story of the Jomsvikings was local history to Grass. 5. Sif's golden hair. Moving on to book 3 of the Tin Drum, and therefore the last 2 episodes, we hear of Oscar's obsession with a nurse, Sister Dorothea. Sister Dorothea is renting a room in a house in Düsseldorf in which Oscar is now staying. And one day he creeps into her room, which he describes to the reader in sinister and voyeuristic detail. In keeping with his dwarfish identity, he hides in the dark, quasi-underground space of her wardrobe. A patent leather belt hanging in the wardrobe takes him back to the incident of the horse's head and the eels, which he replays in his own mind and which Grass retells in considerable detail. Oscar finds a comb with some strands of Dorothea's hair caught in it. He describes finding the hair as his most important discovery ever, because he now knows that Dorothea's hair was blonde. Presumably, her hair was hidden beneath her nurse's cap. He steals the hair and he hides it in his wallet, and he refers to it a bit later as his little treasure. The goddess Sif has beautiful blonde hair, which is cut off by Loki, who is, of course, like Oscar, a malevolent figure. But even in the fantastic world of Oscar's imagination, there's no room for magic golden hair. Blonde hairs caught in a comb, not to mention the dandruff and the fluff which Oscar meticulously details. These things are far more in keeping with the rather squalid setting of Sister Dorothea's room. But there's a bit more. In the Old Norse poem Haubarðsljóð, it's suggested that Sif was unfaithful to Thor. Oscar claims to believe that Dorothea is having an affair with a doctor from the hospital, and he casts himself as the one being betrayed, as if he were actually Dorothea's husband. So finally, 6, licked into life by a cow. For the final parallel with Old Norse, we turn to the very beginning of Old Norse myth and almost the end of the Tin Drum. In Snorri's account of creation, a cow called Auðumla licks salty blocks of ice, and in doing so, gradually licks into shape, literally, a man. At the very end of the penultimate chapter of the Tin Drum, Oscar is on the verge of a new life outside the mental hospital, and he spends the night sleeping in a field. He's awoken the next day by a cow licking him. Oscar notes that she has a heavenly look about her. Thus, licked by a matriarchal cow, Oscar is made ready for a new life. So this brings me to a very brief conclusion. And I want to address the very simple question, why might Grass have filled the tin drum with all these mythic allusions? As it happens, Grass's work raises disturbing questions about establishing and facing truths and about accepting responsibility, especially given the fact, which was kept secret for almost his whole life, that he served in the SS. Oscar's unreliable narration is a crucial factor here. But myth, too, being both in the crudest possible sense that which is not true, and also a metaphorical vehicle of fundamental human truths, is the perfect vehicle to undermine our sense of what we can rely on. For example, the official narrative of history, because myth underlines the linearity of real time. Given what we all know about the notorious valency of Old Norse myth in Nazi ideology, it is, of course, both the greatest irony and yet also somehow inevitable that Grass should use Old Norse as he does. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. And I imagine there's a whole round of virtual applause for you as well. We have time for questions and comments. So I'd like to open it up to the floor. I think that I believe we can just unmute and ask a question, or you can type it into the chat. These seem to be two possibilities, so open it up.
Hi, Andy. Could I ask a question of Ármann?
Please.
Just to start things off.
Yeah.
Ármann, it seemed to me that the most obvious comparator to your marvelous idea about Fosbræðra Saga and the misleadingness of reading it as a realistic narrative is Njál's Saga. There's a great hole, isn't there, at the centre of Njál's Saga about why Njáll and Gunnar are friends, because they're so different.
Yeah, I think it's less urgent because the saga makes more sense read realistically.
Yes.
So my interpretation of Fosbræðra Saga is based on trying to explain what it's about to people, and of course it's conjecture because it's hard to know how audience interpretation was. But I would think it's certainly a possible modern interpretation, and I think it's also a possible medieval interpretation because I think the mindset of the audience was probably more symbolic than we think, and I think in this case it's sort of, I feel it salvages the saga a bit from necessarily being satire, which everyone can remember the turn when everything had to be satire. And especially Helga's fine interpretation, people just flocked to all sagas, seeing them as parodies of each other until nothing left that was not parody. So this is another way to make sense of the sagas.
Yeah. I think it's true, isn't it, that you can make sense of Njál's Saga also by seeing these two figures as embodying different kinds of heroism, old heroism and new heroism, or whatever. So you're right about the urgency. I think that's exactly right. But it's interesting. I don't know if you'd call your approach postmodernist, but kind of modern view is that there must be some kind of erotic same-sex relationship between the two men. But you're kind of past that. You're into now, and it's the same for Njál's Saga, obviously. But you're now into looking at a wholly new idea of why you have these two figures. And I think it works for Njál's Saga too.
the fact that Thorkir is said to not want to stoop to women has sometimes led readers to believe.
Of course, yeah.
In a well, in a different way, but I don't think we need that in this case. Really, I don't think we need any. Thormod is obviously very interested in women.
Yes,
so
yes.
Yeah. To look at it as simply doubles.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, we're taking over here, you and I, Ármann.
Okay. It seems not rude to. How deliberately you think Grass is? Do you think he's appropriating Norse myth from Rosenberg or the Nazis? Like he's developing a different way to use it, because it must have been very problematic in post-war Germany.
Yeah.
You can still in Germany the unease about Norse-Icelandic mythological, because of the gross, usage of it by Nazi myth makers.
Yes, yes, yeah. He didn't admit to being in the Waffen-SS until his memoir, which was published in the early 2000s, I think, Unpeeling the Onion, as if getting to the kind of terrible heart of things, So I think obviously he was deeply ashamed of it, and so I don't think that there's an attempt to appropriate Nazi ideology. But clearly he I don't know where he got the Norse myth from.
But like back from the Nazis in a way.
Yeah. Yes, I see what you mean. Yes. It's that's perfectly possible. But I quite like also the idea that he's using myth because it undermines the official narrative of history. That's another kind of recuperation, isn't it?
I have a question for Heather. At the time that The Tin Drum was written, were there other novelists who were using Old Norse mythology in a similar way, or in a way that was reaching audiences in the same way that The Tin Drum was?
Yeah, the obvious answer is I really don't know. I don't know of other examples where it's so intricately, so very intricately woven into the novel, and I mean it's like it's like basket weave, really. They're all all the allusions are interrelated, and they're all spread beautifully across the book and so on. But I mean, lots of pre-20th century novelists used Old Norse myth, but without probably the whole valency of the Nazi appropriation of Norse myth. I've written on, for instance, Thomas Hardy's The Return of the Native is all about Brynhilde and Sigurd, from the bonfires to the double funeral, it's and so on. And Robert Louis Stevenson, his short story The Waif Woman is based on Erbygir Saga and so on. And poetry, I found that poetry was a better or a more usable vehicle for Old Norse myth allusions, because of the kind of imaginativeness of poetry and the imaginativeness of myth. I think that collision of narrative history and mythological fantasticness, it was very surprising in parts.
Okay. And I also have a question for Ármann. Have you, while conducting this study, have you found examples in any other sagas of Icelanders of this externalization of one character's personality into perhaps multiple characters?
No, I haven't really been looking at it, but I think there's always there's always the possibility of symbolic interpretation. because the sagas are both historical, they're explanation of the past, but they also have a relevance to the present. And you can see it in Fornaldarsögur, like Völsunga Saga, can clearly be seen as a kind of maturation saga, but I think it would be possible to find such elements, but I haven't really been looking for them. It's more like my interest lies more in seeing what such an interpretation can do to a narrative that's like in some ways problematic. So you know, there was quite an angry reaction to Helga Kress's article back in 1987, but it didn't. None of the counter interpretations could get away from the fact that Fosbra Saga is odd. You know, it kept being odd, and I think this is one way to explain its oddness.
Thank you. Questions from the group?
Hi. Can you hear me, Andrew? All okay? Yeah.
Well,
question for Ármann. Heather finished up by saying what she thought that the point of the tin drum was, and you know, I read Gepla long ago in the first English translation, which is called The Happy Warriors, and I certainly took it as ironic, as the title suggested. I wondered if you could say something about what Haldor's intention was in writing the work. Was he trying to, as it were, correct the traditional romantic Viking image?
Yeah, I think he was probably also drawn by its oddness, and in a way he made it make more sense in his own ironic interpretation. But of course the difference between Fosbra Saga and Gepla is that Fosbra Saga believes in the king. You know, there's no irony towards the king. The king is the hero, the king is spiritually, and just the fact that they serve the king makes them better men. Haldor, of course, turns all that on its head, that the king is a nasty figure in the saga, and in the end, when Thormod reaches him, he sees that, you know, service is futile, so he doesn't even perform the poem for the king. So I think his Haldor's attack is more on the figure of the king than on the characters of the Foster brothers, in which, you know, he just takes them as they stand, as comic figures, but has a hard time making them more comic than they already are in this. So this is something Helga has also talked about, Helga Kress. But this is the first Gepla is certainly a parody. So I believe, you know, in a paper recent at the Háskóla Íslands, Helga said that Fosbra Saga is a parody, but Gepla is not. But I don't want to turn things so completely on their head. I think that it's still a parody, and Fosbra Saga is odd, but not necessarily a parody.
Okay, thanks very much, Ármann.
We have time for more questions or comments.
There's one in the chat.
Yes, Chris recommended also that Borges would count as another 20th century writer in the magic realist tradition who was interested in and made use of Norse myth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point, actually. I'd forgotten about Borges, and I used to be obsessed with that story, the story of the old man who suddenly appeared in Central America with the wings, and it was villain. Yeah, and marvelous. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Right.
Okay, well, I think it's been a marvelous first panel. I want to thank both Arman Jakobson and Heather O'Donoghue for opening up the symposium, Transforming Old Norse Icelandic Literature. So thank you both very, very much. And I'll pass it back to Dustin if you have any announcement.
Thanks for your chairmanship, Andy.
Yeah, thanks very much to all the speakers and to you, Andy, as the panel chair. That was wonderful.